I am seeing a lot of my students with extremely strong opinions about things. And those opinions do not track reality, do not track the degree of ambiguity in the world. It's almost like you have zero rewards for raising concerns about how the world is more complex. And you have a lot of rewards for providing round stories, stories that generate no cognitive dissonance.
I think this is a very clear issue. When you're chasing after certain things, you make mistakes. We're guilty of this. Like economists are very guilty of this, of trying to bring in measurement and optimization and these kinds of tools into elementary and secondary education. It's hard to argue that a university education today is better than it was 25 years ago. If actual success or originality or creativity is difficult to measure or proxy with something, then you're going to incentivize the wrong kind of stuff.
The kinds of people that are more accustomed to have used System 2 in their lives, and therefore, because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, they are more aware about how stupid they sound sometimes. These are the people that are less likely to react online. And then you have a world where what is out there is disproportionately coming from people that are more likely to be using their System 1. This is what I would call a recipe for disaster. I don't know about you, but I'm finding that there are less opportunities for people to see how nuance often shows up in the world, how we have conversations where people are not extreme, people are not even posing. If you go to YouTube, most of the channels for me are so preppy, and people already have so formed opinions about things. And they are clearly not formed opinions. You should actually get these people in a room and you ask them, what are they thinking? Their opinion is way more nuanced. So I'm particularly worried about this new generation. How do they even see how conversations happen? Because I am seeing a lot of my students with extremely strong opinions about things. And those opinions do not track reality, do not track the degree of ambiguity in the world. It's almost like you have zero rewards for just raising concerns about how the world is more complex. And you have a lot of rewards about providing round stories, stories that generate no cognitive dissonance. So I felt like it could be useful for people like you and I to discuss even the way we often discuss. Like sometimes I pick up your side because I agree with you, but then you disagree with yourself. And so we change sides and so on. I think this happens a lot in not only how you and I write papers, but also in even regular conversations, personal conversations. Whenever you and I are doing this, of course, we're never recording. So it never shows up to other people. There's never a third person who can see this. And I think it could be a positive externality we generate to the world by just putting out there different forms of conversations, which I don't think are showing up as often.
So I don't know much about the world of podcasts, but I guess they're picking their guests explicitly to have either extreme disagreement or extreme agreement. And they're not ever, why is that not solved?
I would say because of two different things. I think a common model there will be a situation similar to how you and I were interviewed in the past, right? Oftentimes people are interviewing people that have some form of book tour, you know? And the kinds of conversations that show up there, they're not open-ended. I mean, by the sheer fact that you want to sell a book, you tend to end up reducing cognitive dissonance, right? You don't sell books that not have strong opinions about things. But I think the second part of the answer that comes to mind for me is there are some other kinds of models in podcasts where people talk and they kind of wing it, right? And that's great. But I do not think that these kinds of podcasts are created by a representative sample of the population, in the sense that when you think about professors like you and I, we are not doing this kind of stuff. It's fairly rare to see professors doing that, in part because we are not rewarded by doing that at all.
Yeah.
In fact, our whole reward system involves working on papers And papers by themselves, they need to be a final product. So they need to reduce cognitive dissonance to a certain degree, right? You need to tell some form of round story, round narrative. So I find that to be at odds to how I want to behave intellectually, Like literally, you and I have been thinking about a project for over 10 years that we have never wrote a paper about because we don't know how to publish such an idea because this idea is too complex and too multidisciplinary, right?
Yeah.
And another way of seeing this is that perhaps the medium to present those ideas might not be what currently we view as papers and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that in the past, you are getting more of this informal stuff because there was just more interaction. I don't know how to measure this, but you might not have interacted with the same breadth of people, but you interacted way more. Like most people probably interacted 40, 50 hours a week with the people in their department, and they knew a small handful of people really well, and they were interacting with them a lot. And now you don't get to have informal conversation.
I see what you mean. Not only in academia, but in general. Do you think that to some extent, we used to do a lot of physical interactions, but the sheer serendipity of the algorithm that gets you and I to contact each other in physical settings, you and I would be more likely to be a little bit different, which would generate less echo chambers than the counterfactual situation, which is currently what we have now under algorithms, virtual meetings.
Yeah. Just think about the number of virtual seminars on very narrow topics. It's not like labor, public, this, that. They're very, very specific topics that even like a very big department like MIT or Chicago would not be able to have seminars on this, right? So now that you have that bigger market, you're able to have these very narrow seminars and very narrow interactions in general. And then you just are not going to get these conversations. This is not looking at any data, but oftentimes when you read an article about some discovery that somebody made, it's like, oh, it was made by these two researchers that met each other once at some conference in Atlanta in 1978, and they randomly met each other in the lobby and they exchanged this idea, and now they won the Nobel Prize like 40 years later, right? You don't have the random meetings anymore. Or you have fewer random meetings now. I mean, even our conferences, I don't know if you've been to the AEAs anytime recently.
I know, it changed completely.
By getting rid of the job market and by decoupling the job market from that, we just destroyed the biggest place for these kinds of serendipitous interactions to happen. Just absolutely threw it away. That has a little to do with technology because you can do the job market virtually now. But it's like the combination of technology and then policies that lean into the technology is just a really bad idea because there's like large costs in some domains and large benefits in other domains with these technologies. And then if you're doing some pretty naive kind of cost benefit, you'll say, oh, if the costs are bigger than the benefits, that's fine. But I think that's more reasonable when the costs and benefits are denominated in the same units. But when they're not denominated in the same units, you can do some bullshit exchange rate to try to get them into some numeraire unit. But it's hard to quantify in dollars the value of socializing at the AEAs. And it might be easier to quantify in dollars the cost of making people fly there and this and that. But maybe it's not even a well-defined problem to do a cost-benefit analysis of whether you should do this or not. And some people point to, oh, it's because externalities and this and that, you need coordination, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's just as simple as you have people that thought they were doing something justified on cost-benefit grounds, but the cost-benefit analysis, it's just ill-defined, right? And maybe not even feasible. And I think with technology, the things that you gain and the things that you lose are very different domains. Really hard to compare. Like with Zoom, I gained the ability to have meetings from home and talk to all these kinds of people. And the things that I lose are very weird and kind of niche, and I can't even count all of the things, but there is a sense that the world is different and maybe not obviously better because of that sort of stuff.
I never thought about this in the way you're posing this right now. That's very interesting. This reminds me of Albert Einstein's quote, not everything that can be counted counts, right? Because I think there's that tendency for people to project things onto what is objective and not what is subjective. What is objective is measurable by third person, right? So it's easy for you to communicate with each other. But depending on the context, that might not be as important.
Yeah. It's hard to make the evaluation when the things are just very different. And I think that people don't have, and certainly economists are maybe more guilty of this than anybody else, don't have sort of the hubris, the humility of appreciating that, hey, maybe I can't say something on this. I think an example of this to me is education, like all this idea that, oh, we need these metrics to measure things, blah, blah, blah. I think that it's hard to argue right now that a university education today is better than it was 25 years ago when I got a university education. I think that the students are coming in less prepared. So that's a reflection of high school education. They're learning way less. They're held way less to account, and they're getting way less out of it. And this is all because if you think about what universities are doing, they have a number of different objectives, right? If you take the university president, one objective is obviously money and keep donors happy, this and that. The other is minimizing scandals and bad news. But then honestly, the other objective is not learning. Objective is, let me target whatever is in US news and go off of that, right? So you have these measured targets and you chase after those and you delude yourself with the idea that, oh, we can optimize. This is a problem that we can solve when we have these measurements. And you end up with something much worse. We've been doing this for 15 years as professors or so, at least at U of H, where the kind of prestige of the university has improved and the rankings have improved in all these dimensions. It's unambiguously clear to me that the student quality has gotten worse. They don't know much. I can't teach them as much. The same course, the syllabus, it's probably 80% of what it was. So I can't give them as much information and they don't know as much. And I don't think it's that, I mean, maybe I've gotten much worse at teaching. I don't think I've gotten 20% worse. I've probably gotten better, if anything. I think this is like a very clear issue where when you're chasing after certain things, you make mistakes. And I don't know what the alternative is. There's downsides to alternatives where maybe things were less equitable when you weren't measuring everything, but I don't think this is unambiguously better. And I think it's even more extreme when you go down to like elementary and secondary education. The quote unquote reformers, and we're guilty of this, like economists are very guilty of this, of trying to bring in measurement and optimization and these kinds of tools into elementary and secondary education. We fucked it up. Like, kids are not learning nearly as much in elementary school today as they learned when I was in elementary school. And there's lots of reasons for this. I don't think I'm just looking at the past with rose-colored glasses here.
No, I definitely agree with everything you just said. I also wonder what the role of the teacher evaluations is related to that, because I think teacher evaluation, even among people that are tenured like us, it has become more salient in my mind. And I think the teacher evaluation is sort of aligned with everything you said about the KPI, right?
Yeah.
Which, if I care, right, it does preclude me from doing what I think is the best for the students. Because oftentimes, what I think is the best for the students ends up being providing some kinds of tools and skills that the student yet doesn't know he or she has. It will show up later in their life in terms of their adaptability to handle whatever shock happens in their lives. We all know in urban economics, for instance, that cities with a higher degree of college educated people tend to be more resilient to negative economic shocks, in part because people adapt much faster, either by changing occupations or by creating startups themselves, or actually by, within the same kind of job, finding different tasks, right?
I would speculate that that premium is going to decline in the next 20 years. As current college graduates become the backbone of the economy, I would speculate that premium is going to decline. The difference between these cities.
I think it's fair. I agree with that. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that teachers in general do not have the incentive to teach those skills that are less measurable.
Yeah. It comes from the top too, because if you imagine, if you have the system where the thing that you're placing the biggest weight on is, say, a 4-year or 6-year graduation rate, I don't have to tell you what the incentives are. I mean, certainly not to maximize knowledge or accountability.
And I think this point is much more general, right? Like, for instance, if you are thinking about a company that has a stock in the stock market, it is the fiduciary obligation of the CEO of the company to try to maximize profit, right? But then they would direct all their efforts towards things that society might not think is the best way of going there, right?
Or this is your point at the beginning about when I was asking about podcasts, like when this podcast starts to become famous, then you're going to start tracking these metrics of engagement, this and that. And then you're going to be pulled in the direction of doing stuff, even if that wasn't your original. I don't think anybody sets out to make a dumb and crazy whatever podcast, but you start focusing on these metrics because that's how the compensation comes. And then before you know it.
One thing I thought about before I even created this was it has to be something that I feel it's a hobby. As in, I don't need the money for that, thankfully, because I have my job, right? I don't need that. So I thought about that exactly to safeguard myself against this. But you're right that it's not true that I can fully safeguard this, right? It doesn't even have to be related to money. At some point, if I get enough tracking with people and people start liking this and they want something, and like just my ego might feel like, oh, I need to provide that thing that they want. Like, for instance, one thing that I'm always concerned in an environment like that is that, as you know, like for us to even seek nuance in the first place, conversations will have to be very slow, like the one we are having right now, because we don't know yet where we're going, right? So it will be perhaps boring to some people. And because there's a reason why people will keep their attention in a podcast if things are round and with no cognitive dissonances, because cognitive dissonance is painful. We don't want that in general. It's a hard thing to keep with ambiguous statements and things like that. But my understanding is that even with my best intentions, I might eventually cave in to some degree. I hope I don't. And I really am trying to think through this to maybe not cave in, but I'm worried about that issue. One thing that makes me a little optimistic about this is that if I cave in about this, then I'd rather just do my research, because I love doing my research and writing papers. And I already am very happy with that side of me, you know? So the reason why I'm talking about this is because I do not know the answer yet. If I know the answer and the answer is sufficiently round, I go and write the paper. But there are topics that I think are sufficiently multidisciplinary or sufficiently ill-fitted for papers, for academia, that are still extremely important. And that relates to your initial point. As you know, in science in general, we value objectivity a lot, and that's a good thing. There's a reason why we can replicate things and we can falsify things. Objectivity matters. It's very helpful, but it also reduces the scope of the kinds of truths that we can actually go after if you go that way, right?
Yeah. I think this thing you're saying about treating things like hobbies, narrowly, at least in terms of research, this is my impression and maybe your impression too, but the most interesting research tends to be done by people who I feel like are taking their jobs as hobbies. And then there's other very famous and celebrated economists that you know that take their job as they have a very specific agenda, or whether it's professional or otherwise, and it's not sort of a hobby. And I don't think that the work is just not as interesting and not as innovative, I don't think. Whereas the person's like, oh, I'm just curious about this. That's where you have a greater potential. But I think that extends to other stuff. Like I have friends who are very professionally successful in all kinds of different professions. But I think in something like consulting, this is very obvious, where you have people in consulting, they've worked on a bunch of these different projects and they kind of become an expert at something. They don't really know anything about those topics. But then you get them talking about something that is like a hobby, like, oh, let me talk about basketball with you. And now suddenly they will have very original and very innovative ideas. Somebody who has like a serious hobby in one particular domain versus a professional in that domain, you might be able to get a better job done by the professional sometimes, but I think you have a much bigger chance of getting something new. Obviously, there can be barriers to innovation. Like you might need a lot of capital and they're not just going to give it to a hobbyist. If you're being compensated, there's clearly some basis by which you're being compensated that has to be quantified and well-defined. And if actual success or originality or creativity or whatever it is difficult to at least measure or proxy with something, then you're gonna incentivize the wrong kind of stuff, right? For creativity especially, the motivation has to be intrinsic in some way. It has to be tied to something that is just sort of almost more intuitive than quantifiable. I don't think good writers are doing it to make money, right?
I agree. This reminds me a lot of this literature in social psychology about the role of play on kids' plasticity of the brain. Because it turns out that humans, the proportion of their time where they spend on play before they start doing something that you and I might call productive is particularly high. Of course, there are other animals like crows. If you go to YouTube, you see videos of crows. It's so funny how they play as a young crow. But human beings are really high up there in terms of the proportion of the time that they play. I mean, we adults take care of our kids for a much longer period than monkeys do and dogs do. Yeah. It's really hard to understand what is actually happening with their brain as they're playing. Of course, there's several things, but one of the key things is that they are creating lots of different mental models about how other people behave and how counterfactuals happen when they play. I've never done research specifically about that, but from my perception, that's exactly what is happening. But as you know, I do homeschool my kids, and this KPI thing that we're talking about is one of the reasons why I was concerned about keeping them in school. My kids always loved school, actually. They're very social and outgoing, so it was great for them. But I started realizing that they started creating some form of value for things that are so outward and not related to internal motivation. Part of the reason is that the key currency, which is energy, this inner motivation, this is oftentimes the most scarce resource we all have. You see those kids at 5 versus those kids at 10. And you see that the kids at 5, there's something they have there that the kids at 10 don't have. I mean, statistically speaking, right, that most kids at 10 don't have. It's almost like some of their inner motivation gets crushed or something. Because if you think about it, you arrive in a classroom and you don't know what the teacher is about to teach you. I mean, unless you are in a different system, like a Montessori system, most of the time it's not self-driven. It's teachers driven. The teacher is going to tell you what you are about to be taught, and you have to be like on demand there to pay attention and motivated to do that, which is not quite representative about how reality is going to happen when you become a grown-up, right? Because when you become a grown-up, you will be interested about that, and that will trigger potentially you to recruit all your energy and motivation and focus to do that thing. That kind of recruiting that goes on there, that is a skill. How, once you get interested, how does one recruit all those resources necessary for you to do something, right? That is a skill.
So I agree with what you're saying. Although one thing, and this is a sort of a plug more for paternalism in this case, especially for little kids, but also for adults, I think it's really important to force people to do things they don't want to do. You know?
Oh, yeah.
I think these things we talk about, algorithms and getting you siloed on the internet, it's because like you're not forced to read stuff you don't want to read or see stuff you don't want to see or do things you don't want to do. I mean, that's obviously what every parent is doing with their kids. They're not just saying, oh, whatever the kid wants to do at any moment in time, we're going to do that.
Yeah, no, I definitely take your point. I struggle with that as a parent who does homeschool, right? Because I really believe in this idea of hormesis, of what doesn't kill you, make you stronger. A little bit of stress is helpful, first of all, but also more to your point, for instance, think about math. Math is a complicated topic, right? Because you get almost nothing of math immediately, but it opens your doors, particularly the math related to abstraction. It opens your door for you to have so much fun later. But how would a kid know that before, right? So I see the need for some form of paternalism that way. You need to figure out a way for them to tap into that second level where they can actually start appreciating math. And for that, you need to have an internal investment, right?
Well, my fear though is I think there's one model of ways to do that, which is kind of like, let's try to gamify the early parts of math so we get people excited about it. So Khan Academy or RSM and these kinds of things where it's like, oh, we're going to make these fun problems and this and that. And I think it's a nice idea and it's a logical idea, but I think it's not a good idea. And the reason being is, and maybe this makes you sound like a drill sergeant or some old Soviet guy or something, but I think that you don't appreciate what you have learned if it's too fun. Like the struggle per se matters a lot and you appreciate it so much more after the fact. So if you had some game where you're trying to feed bananas to a monkey and that's how you learned how to do multiplication, that's fine. And that's great. There's definitely a role for that. But if that's how you learn all basic math, you're not going to have the same appreciation for what you got than if you're sitting there with a boring piece of paper trying to figure it out. And so there's a real balance there. And I think that the shift has been very extreme towards making learning fun. And it sounds crazy. Like, of course, I want to facilitate learning, but I don't think that maybe even if you facilitate learning, I think the returns to that learning are lower if it's too fun.
So I absolutely agree with what you just said, but I wonder if the reason this is true relates to cognitive dissonance, right? Because if you try to avoid cognitive dissonance by gamifying or by smoothing out the rough edges so that it becomes easy for the person to do that, whenever you don't have cognitive dissonance, some part of your brain turns off. It's similar to a camera with a sensor outside of my house. Like if somebody comes close enough, the camera turns on. If there's nobody, just for energy preservation, right? The camera is off. And I think it relates a lot to the idea about how our brains evolved to be the way they are. Like the moment you find something that you are not expecting, let's call that cognitive dissonance, that's when somehow our brain turns on and we are more likely to pay attention, right? So I wonder if this relates to that. So actually, Carol was talking to me about this like last week. So she has this conjecture that our college students are not learning enough these days exactly because of AI, because of this reason you just said, because AI is smoothing out too much the learning so that you really are not finding those streets that have ended and then you have to turn back. Those things that you and I did in grad school, and it was painful. From our perspective, at the time, it felt like a waste of time, right? But now we are not doing nearly enough of that. And this doesn't stick somehow. I do not know even what it means to stick. It's not necessarily a product of memory or some form of assimilation in your brain, but it doesn't stick for some reason.
I'm saying this out of full ignorance here, but I think this is also what is happening to AI itself. The way AI is learning, it's probably not making enough mistakes, right? This sort of experimentation, exploitation kind of trade-off, it really matters a lot. And I think if you're trying to make a product that works on some measurable domains, we see these metrics for AIs, can they do these tasks and blah, blah, blah. If you're optimizing towards those, I think you're not exploring enough dead-end streets. And now if humans are going to be using this as their kind of default tool, there's two layers that they're never going to be exposed to this kind of stuff. And so, I mean, that's in terms of like what you can actually learn and how you actually learn. But I guess the thing that I was trying to get at was more about the idea that you don't appreciate the learning. Like part of the importance of learning is having an appreciation for knowledge. And you don't have the same appreciation for knowledge when you're deriving it from a game, let's say, than when you derived it from some kind of less fun effort. And the appreciation for knowledge, I think, is what then stimulates you later on to try to seek out more knowledge or seek out nuance or seek out whatever you want to call it here, right? And it's like you could go and buy a really great tomato, or you could work super hard and plant a plant and take care of it, fertilize it, water it, all this stuff over the course of an entire season, and then produce that same tomato. And let's say if they're physically indistinguishable from each other, one of them is going to be appreciated way more than the other.
Let me tell you my model about what you just said. Tell me if it makes sense. So this goes back to Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 in that book, Thinking Fast and Slow. System 1 being the more intuitive, reactionary side, and System 2 being more the analytical side. I think what actually happens is that with this gamification, with AI in general, as they are smoothing out our lives and the way we learn by trying to reduce cognitive dissonance, we are more likely to stay in System 1 and we are less likely to stay in System 2. And I think there are two things happening because of that. First, there's the classic like atrophiation of something you don't use as often, right? Which is you don't acquire enough experience using System 2 or switching off from System 1 to System 2 because you're there less often. Now, that is the first part, which is not the last point you said. The second part, which is the point that you said right now, which I think clearly happened to me and happened to you, is that we have seen enough times in our lives where our System 1 hijacked us and we got screwed.
Yeah.
And because we more often have gone to System 2, we have enough, I guess, exploration so that we can start appreciating more the value of going to System 2. And I think it's sort of a privilege in my position, in your position, to have had enough experiences where our System 1 led us astray. And the reason why we can verify that is because our System 2 have been active enough times to show the ridiculousness of our System 1. Because one concern I have right now, and that relates to what we just discussed, maybe I'm wrong about this because I don't see data on this, but I find that the younger generation, they have particularly less epistemic humility. As in, when they hear something in Twitter, they're way faster at judging that, not from the perspective of the person who said that, but rather from their perspective. And it's less likely for them to step back and think, what don't I know about that person's situation that perhaps if I knew, maybe I would change my mind. And of course, everybody does that. I do this all the time. Most of my time, I am in System 1 for sure. But I would argue that people that have seen enough failures of System 1, they are more inclined to go to System 2. And the way I think one verifies failures of System 1 oftentimes is by bringing System 2 up more often.
So are you suggesting that we're outsourcing System 2 to either some technology or institution or something, or we're just not even using it? Like, we need System 2, right? So are you saying that we're going to become less fit because we're not going to be using System 2? Or are you saying that we're making up for it in some other way?
What I was suggesting initially was just the second point you made, which is we are not outsourcing, we're spending a lower proportion of our time and energy on System 2 as a group, as humanity. Now, I would say that there's one interesting nuance here that is worth talking about, which is the fact that with social media, it turns out that people have the ability to start producing things to generate externality, let it be positive or negative externality to the world, by just speaking or retweeting or tweeting something, right? And right now, the barriers of entry to start regurgitating something, which may be your opinion or maybe somebody else's opinion, the barriers of entry are so low. And I really do not mean barriers of entry that some people should have the ability to do that and other people's don't. In fact, I really like the fact that everybody has the ability to do that now. That's really great. But I'm concerned with for a given person, now it becomes easier for them to start doing that. And that is a problem because I think this means that because most of the time we are in System 1's mode, the proportion of reported information out there, reported feelings out there, and so on, that comes from system one is higher because of that.
So let me go back to a different point slightly, which is this idea that I would say that the bulk of innovation, tens of thousands of years ago, all these different innovations, agriculture, like all these things were things that allowed us to basically not have to use system one as much, right? Oh, we have agriculture. I don't have to worry about my food. I don't have to be hunting stuff, walls, like houses, these kinds of things. Everything we did was a way to allow ourselves to shift time from being in system one to being in system two. So I bet if you're the caveman, you basically have very, very little system two time to yourself, right? You're mostly system one time because survival is key and you're doing all these kinds of things. And then if you're Isaac Newton, you have more system two time than system one time. You can come up with gravity and this kind of stuff, right? And sort of the core arc of innovation has been figuring out ways to put ourselves more into system two time, which of course then the return will be you get more innovation, right? But if what you're saying now, and I don't know if this is even what you're saying, so you could say no, but if what we're doing now is basically we have this substitute for system two thinking, so now we're not doing as much system two, we go to system one. I mean, maybe we get more innovation just because we're outsourcing the innovation itself to this new system two creature. But let's go to 20 years ago where these things are happening already and we don't have AI, right, in any meaningful way. Were we shifting things back away from system two back into system one? And if we're doing that, this seems like bending against the arc of progress, or at least human progress, in a very fundamental way. Because my maybe incomplete, ignorant understanding of it all was you got to have that system one because it plays really important roles for survival and quick thinking, but the real action is in system two. And so everything has been made possible by giving us the opportunity to do system two stuff. And if we're losing that, then that would be a massive maladaptation if that's what we're doing.
So that is part of what I'm saying, but I think it's incomplete. And I think the reason it's incomplete is relevant here. So I do agree, first of all, that we are spending less time and energy on system two. And I think it speaks to your original point about perhaps the gamification of the world and the fact that we are feeling more comfortable.
Yeah. Just the passive way that we take in information used to be much more active, or the passive way in which we learn. But wait, real quick, that's a phenomenon of like the last, say, 50 years.
I agree. I absolutely agree with that. Okay. But this is why I want to say the second point. The second point is what, in my view, generates more polarization in the issues that we are seeing in the world right now. The second thing, which I think is much newer, is the idea of regurgitation, the production from the part of every individual. Now, I do not believe that what is out there from me or from any person is representative of the time I spend on system one and system two. That is the exact reason why I came up with this podcast, right? Because I don't think it's representative. Conversations like the one you and I are having right now, we are using, or at least we are trying to use a higher proportion of our time on system two. And those things don't show up in YouTube. They just don't. Why? Because when people interview us about our work on segregation, we are on system one most of the time. This is very easy because we have built the intuition because we've been working on that for over 10 years, right? It's mostly system one. Even people that have studied the topic are in system one, let alone YouTubers that are just talking the reaction on a football game or something like that. It's different. But even in that situation, the proportion of the time that is spent on system two is actually higher in the actual world than it shows up for other people. And I think that is the problem. That is what is more recent. And I think this relates to the idea that barriers of entry had gone down a lot into producing things. Like when we write a paper, maybe in the beginning we start with system one, but our final product, it's essentially all system two, right? That's exactly what a paper is. And nobody except you and I saw the early drafts. So
Yeah.
at the end of the day, our final product that shows up to a third person is 100% system two, right? Or close to 100% system two. So that is not what is happening right now. What is happening right now is that even right now, I'm seeing things that sometimes there are system one things coming up there. And now I'm talking about a third level problem, which is the kinds of people that are more accustomed to have used system two in their lives. And therefore, because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, they are more aware about how stupid they sound sometimes. These are the people, they are less likely to go to YouTube on top of it. And then you have a world where what is out there is disproportionately coming from people that have mostly used their system one, and they are more likely at a given point to be using their system one. This is what I would call a recipe for disaster. You see?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah. I do not know how to solve this problem, but I do think it relates to a lot of the stuff that you and I have worked on. I really believe it relates to the concept of segregation that you and I study, except how you and I define segregation, not necessarily how most people define segregation, namely the fact that different people make different choices. And I don't mean necessarily by different race, it could be any difference. And I don't mean residential choice, it could be all kinds of choices, including choices which media they watch and which conversation they decide to join and things like that. I do believe segregation is inevitable because that's just a manifestation of differences of taste and differences of preference. So there's no way out of that. And of course, as we know, it generates a lot of negative externalities. And we need to figure out how to solve those negative externalities. But a key one is the one we're talking about. I think this is the most important one, which is the lack of epistemic humility and the social norm that has evolved in the past, I would say 15, 20 years because of social media and these newer technologies, the new social norm where it is okay not to have epistemic humility. And in fact, you are rewarded for not having epistemic humility and you are punished for having, for not knowing for sure, for being ambiguous. You're punished for that.
Yeah. Yeah, but maybe that is the requirement because the costs of production have gone down so much that there's just too much out there that you need to have a higher bar to try to. But yeah, it's not obvious to me what actually gets things looked at, what actually makes things catch on versus not. I don't think that there's much demand for this. What you're talking about, I don't think there's much demand for it, which is not great. But it's particularly low now because there are so many alternatives. In the past, there weren't as many alternatives. Yeah, so learning about topic X in the past, your only options were going to experts on X, getting a book, going to a lecture, this or that. And so even though there was low demand for it, whenever you did get that information, it was system 2 vetted kind of information, reflective of system 2. And now that's still there, but the alternatives have gotten so cheap that.
I agree. But I would say that the reason why there's less demand for system 2 is a good thing. It's because engineers have solved a lot of problems for us. Like whenever you get an iPhone and you're going to give a call, I don't need to know quantum physics. I don't need to know anything about internet. And I just press a button and somehow I call you, right? Back in the day when my dad was first driving a car, he would actually have to learn a lot about mechanics in order to even handle the car, right? So I think that's an important benefit that engineers have created now. But then, of course, there's this general equilibrium effect, which is what happens as a second level. Now that you're smoothing out or making sure people are okay using their system one, and so the time, now the price of not using system two, it changed.
Very cheap.
It's very cheap. And of course, when the price of something goes down, people demand more of that.
Yeah. And you substitute towards really low value activities.
Yes. And to be clear, this is a good thing. The problem is not that. The problem is that I think eventually we'll have to go into the algorithm, which is why don't we figure out a way, or perhaps how do we even figure out a way to not give a megaphone to people when they are under their system one? And how can we give megaphones to people when they are in system two? Like, at least to the extent that this is our goal, which is to create more nuance in the world or reduce polarization, things like that. Maybe that's a way to think about how can you like dial up the volume for the people during the time where those people are speaking under their system two, and dial down people when they are under their system one. Or perhaps we should have a hybrid method, right? We should have a hybrid approach where maybe there's another social media environment where you want to dial up also the system one part, but ideally we should somehow signal to everybody there that we're just winging it, right? This is almost like a form of art, of conceiving things. Like, for instance, some of our conversations is stay in system one all the time when we are in like idea mode, right? Like, for instance, when you come up with an idea in that idea mode, I almost never say, no, I disagree. It's almost like what we do in the what's it called? Improv.
Yeah.
I always say yes and you say yes and we keep just steering towards the more intuitive side for us, what we think is the correct thing. I think there's role for that. There's a lot of reasons why we want to stay system one, but I don't think it's sustainable for us to represent the world mostly via system one, the way we are currently represented. I believe there's way more conversations under system two, like the one we are having, that just do not show up in the world. And I think we are not seeing the representative conversations out there. Of course, some of the system one conversations probably happening in the world, they are not represented too because they are too crazy. But I do think that there's a lot of the system two that is not showing up in the world. And that is in part why we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
So I think we might want to stop here, but I wonder, maybe we want to talk in the next occasion about how would you think about this algorithm? What would be the kinds of desirable features of an algorithm where nuance would emerge?
Yeah.
Because I think we're still crawling on this. I have seen very few papers on this. And again, because papers are restricting the kinds of ways they are allowed to say, because there cannot be too multidisciplinary. It has to provide a round story, a round narrative. I wonder if this medium that we have here could be better to do these kinds of discussions. Okay, cool.
Cool. All right.